Ship crewman, what was the creepiest experience you had out in the ocean?
Story 1. Not a ship, but you know in the movies the creaking sounds in a submarine from the pressure when going deep? The first time you hear them for real is a bit unnerving. Story 2. Worked for a bit as a deckhand on fishing boats out of San Diego. A few times we would come across deserted small boats, pangas, drifting with outlandishly big motors. Every time, the captain would just cut hard port or starboard to get away from them as quickly as possible. I knew there were running boats that had probably dropped off their cargo, but I would check them out with the binoculars if we were close. One had 2 people on it. Both had clearly been shot a bunch of times, and one was moving and fairly alive. I told the captain, got a disapproving headshake, and we were on our way. Story 3. 6 years ago. Deep fog, like I couldn't see the front of the yacht, sailing, and it was only 50 feet. The real creepy part came from the radar system tracking the boats and ships around us. Radar, not being a commercial shipping or fisherman spec, was not quite as accurate, so sometimes boats would disappear, be right on top of us, or appear in sight but not on the radar. That, on top of the sheer quantity of marine debris throughout the ocean, made me really scared that some boats had sunk when they dropped off the radar. Story 4. The doldrums. You spend a year or two at sea watching the waves and winds blowing constantly, and then one day they stop. Not so much as a whisper of wind and the sea is like glass. It feels as if time has stopped. Realizing how creepy it feels, the captain calls for an all-stop and goes dead in the water. Like a horror movie, everyone migrates topside and just stares at the horizon. No one says a word and you can hear yourself breathe. He lets the ship rest there for an hour and the sailors freak out, panic and set in quickly with a green crew. The only thing the captain says when we get underway is, "Men, this is the doldrums." The knew what he was doing. Story 5. I got to see glowing algae on top of the ocean in the middle of the night, having a smoke on the upper decks and after my watch on a warship. Surreal, and extremely uncommon, but a memory I'll have for the rest of my life. Story 6. Not a crewman myself, but I'm fortunate enough to know a lovely guy called Ron Warwick, who was the captain of Cunard's Queen Elizabeth II liner for years. I once asked him what the oddest thing he'd ever seen at sea was. His reply was precisely this. "I saw a wave once. It was quite big." I have to say I was a bit disappointed. I mean, we've all seen big waves, but a mutual friend suggested I look it up. It turns out, Ron was talking about this monster, the rogue wave. Story 7. Came upon an empty life raft in the middle of the Atlantic. In all likelihood, it was probably an accidental discharge. Maybe a crew member was f***ing around with a release or something, who knows. The implications otherwise are very disturbing though. Did a ship go down with all hands without anyone making it to the raft? Was the raft abandoned for some reason? It left me feeling vaguely disturbed for a while afterward. Story 8. U.S. Marine here. During a float on a boat to Operation Top Secret, Destination Unknown, one of our own was lost at sea. I guess they just jumped overboard at night or something. Kinda depressing. That's a way to die. Anyways, their coffin rack was adjacent to mine, and we left the rack made, and for some reason, the sheets kept on getting messed up every day. It was a pain in the ass to keep making the sheets. We stripped the rack, and we figured that no one should be sleeping in there since there were plenty of other vacant racks in the berth thing. But someone would keep making the rack and messing the sheets up in the morning. I know aircraft carriers are big, but could someone really fake their own death on one and get away with it? There's no way someone would be sleeping there because we'd noticed someone climbing up on the top bunk, and the duty would have been posted at the entrances to the berthing. It was just creepy seeing the rack being made neatly and then messed up in the morning. Story 9. Cousin is a ship captain or something. One time they were loading cargo from Bandar Abbas Bay in Iran to transport to Abu Dhabi in the UAE. A cat had climbed on board without anyone noticing. Halfway through the Persian Gulf, she began meowing like crazy and they all legit got spooked. Some started saying ghosts or thinking they were legit sailing in haunted waters. After 3 hours of shipmates searching like crazy, they finally found her hiding between cargo containers. They dropped her off in Abu Dhabi as an illegal immigrant. Story 10. Not ship crew, but one of 3 guys sailing a 45-foot Morgan from Antigua to Daytona Beach, Florida. I had zero crossing experience prior to this trip. Anywho, I pictured getting tan, pina coladas, and white sand beaches. Nope, it was an open ocean, at least by landlubber standards, and 3-hour shifts round the clock manning the helms, GPS, and radar while the other 2 guys chilled during the day or slept at night. It was hard as hell, and I've done a few things considered somewhat tough and out of the ordinary. The biggest worry while on autopilot are the bazillions of ships flying around throughout the Caribbean. Yes, you can see them from many miles away, especially at night with the help of a radar, but they sneak up on you. And a 600-foot freighter captained by a possibly hammered crewman in the wheelhouse at 2 in the morning wouldn't even feel a bump as it split us into kindling. So one night I'm on shift, trying to stay awake with Snickers and coffee, and it's so black you couldn't discern the horizon line. Just stars, blackness, and the running lights of lots of far-off freighters going in all directions. I proceed to take my occasional 360-degree glance around like I was told to make sure there's also nothing coming up aft. And oh my god. There's this giant round yellow light stretching what seemed like across the entire sky directly behind me. Clearly this was a freighter directly behind our boat with some kind of a spotlight on the bow trained on us, and about to gobble us up like Jonah. The rush of terror was so great I couldn't even stomp on the deck to awaken my mates, let alone scream for help. So I just accepted my impending death and wondered if it would be the impact or drowning that killed me first. Then I focused a little harder and realized it wasn't a ship at all. It was a full moon rising. I can't describe the immediate relief. It was like waking from the most terrifying dream you've ever had and realizing, holy smokes, I'm not running from Freddy Krueger. I'm in my bed. Sailing a crossing like that, I learned as hours and hours and sometimes days and days of endless boredom punctuated with short periods of silence. Story 11. I don't know if this was creepy exactly, but it sure scared us. Up by Alaska in rough seas, our office was below the waterline on the outside of the ship, and right below a sponson. There was a full-size I-beam running around the outside edge of the office. It was probably 10 inches wide and we used it as a shelf, storing full-size binders on it. One day in rough weather, 6 of us were in the office, 3 officers, 3 enlisted, when we heard an enormous bang, so loud that our ears rang, and all of us jumped out of our seats. After checking to make sure we weren't taking on water, and calling damage control, we started looking around to determine what could have caused it. We couldn't find anything. Nothing came loose, nothing had fallen, the dry tank below the office was still dry, etc. We eventually noticed that the I-beam had cracked. Not a hairline fracture, not a little split, but the entire beam had separated lengthwise by about 5 millimeters. We took a wave up under the sponson with so much energy that it bowed in the hull of the ship and split the beam, but the beam didn't ever go back to the original length. The crack was also precise and even. You could slide a pencil in the gap all the way back to the bulkhead. In fact, the split was so wide they couldn't wield it directly closed. They had to cut a 5mm shim to fill the gap. It was amazing. We had hundreds of people come through the office for the next couple of weeks to see it. A couple of people tried to calculate the energy needed to instantly separate the I-beam. That was 4 feet away from where we were sitting, but it was too scary to contemplate. Story 12. A friend, a captain, asked me to help deliver a sailboat from Fort Lauderdale to Houston. I was somewhat an inexperienced sailor, only sailed for fun a few times, short trips. But he was able to get me $100 a day, so I said, why not? I was between jobs. There was 3 of us, me, my captain, who was a very experienced sailor, and the new owner of the ship. Once we got to Anna Maria Island in the west coast of Florida, we prepared for the longest haul of our trip. The first time we'll be away from the coast going through the Gulf of Mexico. We did a 4-hour shift, then you'd get to sleep or do whatever for 8 hours until your next 4 hours. The eerie part for me was my shift. Alone, pitch black, darkness in the middle of the ocean, no moon out. You also have to avoid a lot of small oil rigs, some still active, some not active, some marked with lights, some not. You'd hear unexplainable sounds, etc. I don't know if it was just my head with me, but that one overnight shift was pretty tense and scary for me. Toward the end of my shift, we hit some pretty bad rains and rough seas. My captain took over, I went to bed. I get woken up a bit later to crazy rough seas. I go back on deck and my captain, the owner of the ship, just yell, "We have to turn back. We lost our GPS." Apparently the wind knocked it off the top of the mast and into the ocean. So there we are now, rough seas, pitch black, and with no GPS. Luckily my captain is old school and knows how to sail with just a chart. So we made it back to Anna Maria and purchased a new GPS. The whole event was just surreal, and I was definitely worried a few times. The rest of the trip was uneventful. The next nights had nice bright moons and calm seas that made it a little less eerie. Story 13. Not creepy, but gross. I was chumming and cutting bait at 5 a.m. on Jeffrey's Ledge in New England. I kept hearing weird splashing sounds every few minutes, but it was still dark. I was a noob at that time. Around 5:30, I could see a little better, but not great. I think I kept seeing a buoy looking like a giant road cone popping up out of the water, then it would disappear again. I was full on, what the f***? The captain comes out on the deck and catches me staring off into the sea. He looks out, the road cone pops up a few hundred yards off. He looks back at me and starts laughing his ass off. "How long have you been watching that whale mask?" Humpback whales mask by rolling around on the surface of the water using the splash as friction. Story 14. Found a sailboat adrift after a storm in the Atlantic with nobody aboard. We decided to tow it to Florida. A couple of us went aboard to attach the line. There was a foot of water and tons of bondage floating around in it. Never found out who the owner was, reported it in Key West and left it in the harbor. Story 15. I worked as a deckhand on a private 53-foot yacht. I helped deliver it from the east coast of the US to the Virgin Islands with a pit stop in Bermuda. En route to Bermuda, I wake up and head up to accompany the guy on watch, and he looks pretty disturbed and points up. Our cockpit had a cloth bimini with a plastic window on the top. Roof thing over the helm for you non-nautical folks. Now, the plastic window are 2 boot prints in the salt residue. There's no way anyone could stand in the bimini. It's cloth and would have broken. We never figured out how it happened and the captain brushed it off, probably so I wouldn't be freaked out since it was my first time at sea. Not terrifying, definitely weird. It could have been a prank, but no one was laughing. And who would risk losing their boots overboard for a stupid prank? Story 16. I sail on tall ships, with temp crews of young people, 16 to 18 usually. We discourage ghost or creepy stories because there's always some kid who gets inspired and takes it too far. And between rig climbings and weather and the general danger of being at sea, we really don't want that. So no outright creepy stuff, but the sea can be plenty eerie. Being in thick fog and hearing sounds that seem close by, but usually aren't, can be pretty chilling. Buoys that have sound signals can sound spooky as hell. The way the eye tries to make sense of distances when the sea is mostly flat can be really alarming. Look out. I thought that thing was a mile off and now it is at our bow. Then there's the time we were in the middle of the Atlantic and the main anchor started letting out just after I came off evening watch. I dashed out of the mess and went onto the foredeck to ram on the brakes, which turned out later to be about 2 to 3 seconds before the anchor and chain combined would have been too heavy to haul back in. We had been pounding in an 8-meter swell for days, so I assumed the brakes and the slip must have just rattled loose in the relentless motion. But the bosun swore up and down that he double secured the slip with a rope and that there was no way it could have come loose on its own. Story 17. This was over 30 years ago. We were living abroad, a 22 day, our first boat. We pulled into a dock and we were trying to sleep. We heard the crackling sound, almost like twigs burning. It was very concerning. I was trying to figure out what was wrong with my boat. Our neighbor didn't help. He said it was fiberglass worms. Apparently, this is some mollusk that attaches itself to the hull and clicks in some way that the hull picked up and amplified. Story 18. First day on my first ship ever. It's winter and like 30 degrees, and the steel bulkheads, racks, etc. are cold. Shipmate is nice enough to give me a small electric alarm clock to use the next morning. I climb in my rack and put the alarm over my head, kinda under the pillow, and crash. At 2 a.m., I woke up after feeling something weird. Something just ran across my boot camp shaved head. I open my eyes and stare into the darkness. Then something else runs across my head. I turn on my overhead light in my rack and about 24 roaches run for their lives. They were nesting on my alarm clock in my head to keep warm. Yes, this was a new guy joke. Yes, I used it later on someone else. No, it was almost 30 years ago and I haven't forgotten. I still feel them sometimes. Same ship, out at sea. Took a shortcut through the civilian berthing, bedrooms area. About 15 of them were sitting around a TV watching animal. Some were laughing, but others were too focused. Another ship, out at sea. When emergencies happen, it doesn't matter who you are sometimes, you have to get dirty. A line ruptured and flooded several spaces with pitch black oil, about neck high. On top of that, we were sure there were a few bodies in there. I and a buddy had to climb into the oil pool and wade through 2 rooms to get the pumps placed and confirm other things. Power's cut off, of course, so we had nothing but flashlights. Yes, we found one of the bodies. The other guy was actually elsewhere napping on the job. Probably saved his own life. There are plenty more, but those are the first 3. Story 19. We had a naval chief petty officer die of a heart attack while underway on board our sub. Since we were doing spec ops off the USSR coastline, we could not surface and come off the station for 60 days. So every time we had to go into the freezer to get food, there was the chief laying on the shelf with his eyes wide open and frozen. He was wrapped in a cling wrap material so you could see his face clearly. So next time you open your freezer at night, just think of having to look at someone's face looking back at you. Story 20. I was sailing as a cadet in a 1,000-foot-plus container ship crossing the Atlantic during the middle of winter, leaving the Mediterranean and heading to Halifax. We were in 40 to 50-foot seas. I was sent to check the side port, a hatch on the side of the ship used for taking on stores or a pilot. Our sister ship had a case where her side port was leaking during rough seas. I went down 11 stories to the engine room and took the tunnel to the side port. The ship has 2 tunnels that run the length of the ship from the engine room at the stern all the way forward to the windlass at the bow. As I was in the tunnel, it looked all the way forward, nearly 1,000 feet forward. I could see the ship twisting as we took each wave. Steel was moaning so loudly that it was extremely unnerving to a new mariner. What I saw on the side port was more unnerving. Every time we took a wave, water would rush through the cracks. Luckily, there was a bilge pump to take care of that. My job over the next few days was to make sure the pump was keeping up. Story 21. Not saw, but heard. Well, that's not entirely true. Another crew member did claim he saw another boat right around sunset, but I never saw it. Anyway, I'm alone on the bridge of this private yacht I worked on. I wanted the bridge time, and the only time to get it was at night as I was the new guy. So I'm on the bridge alone and I'm messing with the radio just out of boredom. All of a sudden, I hear a little girl's voice asking if there's anyone out there. I respond normally and ask if she needs anything. I'm assuming she's playing with Dad's radio. She says she hasn't heard from anyone in a really long time. Says she's been at sea for what seemed like forever. I ask her if she's with her family and she says they're here, but they won't talk to her anymore. She says they're all, this really creeped me out, all getting really angry and screaming at each other all the time. I ask the name of her boat and she tells me the name of a ship I knew to have sunk 6 years ago in the same area. I'm really creeped out now, considering waking someone up. I asked her if she needs anything and her reply still haunts me. She says, "I need about $350." Story 22. I've spent about 9 years out at sea and there were a couple of things that stuck with me. The very worst was a colleague hanging himself overboard on purpose, going next to a tornado off the coast of Taiwan and the massive waves around us. Hearing a PA from the captain to pick up a heavy tool and head on the back of a ship next to the handrail, and it was not a drill. Turned out that a ship that went past us in the opposite direction changed direction and started following us. Nothing came out of it. The very last one I remember was hearing a splash and start looking overboard to spot what fell in the water, only to realize it was dolphins playing. Story 23. Woke up at 3 a.m. to a search and rescue alarm. Former coastie. I book it to the boat, we launch and end up cruising along for a few hours. Everything is pitch black. One of the crew members is looking over the side at the bioluminescent algae being kicked up by our wake and says he saw something big roll over in our wake. We explained that it was probably a shark, and about 15 minutes later, a deep fog sets in. The fog is reflecting our running lights, so it looks like we're in a hallway or tunnel. Everyone gets a little tenser. We start keeping a close eye on the GPS, and then the fathometer alarm goes off, and we are in 5 feet of ocean. The alarm stops, we're in 300 feet, and then 3, and then 250, and then 6 feet. Something was swimming very close to the bottom of our boat. It was such an eerie experience. We never figured out what it was. Perhaps whales? Or the Kraken? We got to the boat we were rescuing and everything else was uneventful. There's something wonderful about being on the ocean in the middle of the night, but things can be very strange too. Story 24. I worked on a cruise ship going from the UK to Spain and back. Cross-channel ferry really, but quite big at 37,000 tons, 2,500 passengers. We had a turnaround of about 4 hours in Bilbao, and at this time, I worked in the restaurant. After we had cleaned up, they started hailing a passenger over the loudspeakers to disembark. I remember he had a slightly comical name like Passenger Peckham or Passenger Pickles or something. Then the managers came and told us to start searching our stations for him. Every bit of the ship was getting searched. They kept hailing him and us searching right up until the outbound passengers started embarking. They even had us searching in little cupboards and in fridges, etc. Obviously, Passenger Pickles had jumped off in the night into the cold Atlantic. So another time we were heading off at night during the winter gales, and about 5 hours offshore around midnight, I finished my shift and headed off to a crafty little platform at the stern, where I could take my nightly reefer in peace, and I saw the massive bright ship's spotlights scanning slowly and methodically back and forth across the waves. I guess this was for a jumper, and sitting there slightly baked, I could imagine perhaps glimpsing a last sight of some poor doomed soul struggling to chop and wake before disappearing off into the vast black expanse of the Atlantic. An office later confirmed the spotlights that night were for someone who had apparently jumped off a ship that had passed in the opposite direction.